that it's meant to be a sort of transformative yagya.
Well, thank you very much for that, those insights as well. I think I'd like now to move on, if you permit me, to the great derangement, because we've just come up in a few stray mentions here and there, because I want to spend a little bit of time, if you'll allow me, on this extraordinary, extraordinary work, this work of tremendous power and scope, so that our experience of reading it is, I think, and Gopal Gandhi used this phrase, truly transformational. It's a transformational exercise to read that book. And I wasn't able to discuss it with you, Amitav, when it was launched last year. And I, feel great regret, but also great happiness that I'm able to discuss it with you now. You may have seen that it was my selection for best book
Oh, thank you.
in Biblio, and it would have been my best book for a decade and more. I mean, honestly,
Thank you.
it's just an extraordinary book. And it begins with, I'll just remind you all, with a vivid description of a tornado in Delhi. And I noticed, looking at your blog, that it's inspired at least one student to write to you with describing a similar experience in Kolkata. And what you're saying at the start of the book, at least, is that we have been lulled by bourgeois capitalism and its modes of self representation to think of the world as relatively safe, orderly, and to adopt a kind of gradualist notion of how things happen. And but all the time, the immense forces of non-human nature are just listening and waiting, waiting to, catch us up, to engulf us in a catastrophe so immense that neither the novel nor us generally have been able to think of it. And so you are arraigning here bourgeois capitalism and, as I said, its modes of self representation, but also the novel as a genre, because it seems to have played a kind of confidence trick on us. It's made us believe in a relatively orderly and banal world, principally inhabited by human beings, interested only in money, sex, and property. And you say that it's precisely, this is why I'm sort of quickly looking at my notes, precisely by excluding those inconceivably large forces and by telescoping the changes into the duration of a limited time horizon, that the novel becomes narratable. Would you like to, because we've been talking about your novels, and we are now talking about a nonfiction collection of a set of 4 essays that you delivered at Chicago. Would you like to begin with this relation between what fiction tells us about the world and what the world is like?
Well, the first thing I have to say there is that when we say fiction, we tend to sort of have in mind the what one might call modern fiction, a sort of post 19th century phenomenon, a sort of modern fiction that comes into being. But of course, fiction, that isn't all that fiction is. Fiction has existed in so many forms for such a long time. And I think, especially verse fiction had a completely different take upon the world than modern prose fiction does, I think when we say prose, it's not an accident, really, that the word prosaic derives from prose. What is this? So, if you look at other forms, I've been recently reading, or rather rereading, Dinesh Chandra Sen's Ballads of Eastern Bengal. Yeah, you'll know them. And the vision of the world that's presented in these ballads. I don't know if whether the Bangla texts exist. I would really love to see the Bangla texts. Nobody has been able to find them for me, but I'm sure they must be in the somewhere. Oh, I would love to have them. Thank you. If you look at the whole sort of fictional world of these ballads, they're so different from anything that one sees in contemporary Indian fiction or even in 19th century Indian fiction. They're full of storms, earthquakes, voyages, travels in the seas, you
Yes.
know. So you look at that literature, you look at the Mongol Kabbos, again, if you think of say, the Manusha Mongol Kabbo,
Mm.
what is so interesting about it is exactly these things, uh, the snakes,
Yes.
the sort of intense sort of intentionality, the
Mm.
agency that is ascribed to snakes.
Yes.
And it's so much a feature of Indian writing. I mean, you look at even Kashiram Das's Mahabharat,
Yes.
the Adi Parv is all about snakes.
Yes.
you know, it's basically the whole story is about snakes. So and these snakes are snakes which have agency, which have a motive power, and so on, which constantly interfere in human activity, snakes, storms, etc. So you come away from that, and then you look at sort of like. I mean, let's forget the literature of today, which is so urban centered, where really, the world around us hardly plays any part at all. But in between, of course, we also have writers like Mohashid Adi,
Yes.
we have Tita Shaktanuddin Nam, again, we have.
Akhtaruzzaman Ilyas's Khwabnama.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
So, see, I think what today passes for fiction is not all that fiction can be. I think
Yes.
fiction
Yes.
can be much more than this.
Yes.
And, I think we are at a point when we have to look at other forms of fiction, alternative forms of fiction, to find a way that in which we can address climate change, because we should have no doubt about it. You and I, maybe we won't see the worst impacts, but almost everybody here will live to see the worst impacts. And these impacts, I think very few people actually pay attention to what is coming down the road very, very soon, especially for a city like Calcutta, which is below sea level. I'm glad Presidency College has had 200 years, but I don't think it's going to have another 200.
Yes.
In fact, it'll be lucky to have another 20.
Yes.
This is the reality of the world that we inhabit. I mean, a very minor sea level rise is actually going to swamp this entire city in ways that are going to be completely horrifying to behold. And that may well even happen within our lifetimes.
Yes. Well, again, things that occurred to me as I was listening to you, the Chondi Mongol, on which I've worked particularly, is full of storms and, as you said, travel, sea voyaging, being overtaken by storms, being confined by malevolent deities who are also forces of nature, and certainly a completely different way of conceiving of the fictional, the improbable, the fantastic. That's not really just a category. I mean, one doesn't necessarily have to say this is improbable or fantastic. It's the nature of the genre that things like this will happen. But about your point about Presidency College, again, memories of being in this college and being here, the floods, I can remember many years of very, very severe flooding, at which, one of which the library was destroyed. Many of the stacks were underwater for days. And, with the college library, in my opinion, has never really recovered from those two particular instances. Perhaps Shukanta will correct me. Two special instances of very severe flooding where the stacks were flooded and have been underwater. When we were young, to come to Presidency College was a daily adventure during the monsoon. Walking up Harrison Road, you were sometimes waist deep in water. One day, I came here to invigilate in an exam, and the exam was later cancelled, and there was this huge problem about, what validity that exam should have. Shantosh Bhattacharya was then the Vice Chancellor of Calcutta University. But I'd like to ask you about another question which arises out of the Great Derangement. You say that the novel has constructed, it's not just a question of the plot or the nature of the events, but also a quite imaginary notion of the human person within what we might call a knowable community. This construction is situated with great care in a setting that is furnished with what we think of as realist details founded on a kind of naturalism. But this naturalism is not really naturalism because it is based on a monstrous denial of all that is strange, irregular, cataclysmic in nature. And it privileges this bourgeois banality of everyday existence, which the poor, accustomed to living life on the brink, never actually have the luxury of experiencing. So it's a middle class illusion to believe that life is safe and that human beings are of a kind so that you know them as your intimate relatives, your kin. But that is not true. That in fact is not true. The person living next door to you could be a monster who is going around raping children.
Yes.
So, this idea that society is a safe place and that human beings are of a certain kind is also an illusion fostered by the novel. And would you say that, in The Great Derangement, you're commenting on the novel, but also making a statement for your own somewhat, in some way, eccentric and flamboyant characters?
Yes, I suppose that is true. Yes, I mean my characters are not so much are not quite as genteel as many characters tend to be. But yes, I think it's absolutely the case that what we see in the world of fiction, of prose fiction, which we could also call prosaic fiction, is the suppression of an entire domain of existence. And it actually completely depends on the ways in which you approach the whole issue of living or life or whatever. Because, of course, the novel claims to be realist, but no one is so realist as to waste time describing how the character brushes their teeth every morning, So obviously you make choices about what it is that is interesting to represent, what it is that, constitutes so-called reality. But that's just a step away from, choosing the extraordinary and the unusual. So, yes, I think what actually happens within the scope of the novel is a deliberate suppression of all that is extraordinary and unusual in our lives.
In fact, you refer to contrasted novels in that set of essays. You refer to Rajmohan's Wife by Bankim Chandra, which is his first work in English. And you also speak of Advaita Mallobarman's Titas Ekti Nodin Naam. And it's a representative of the river novel, which I think, Amitav, you've made peculiarly your own. And it was Bhashyati Chakraborty, who in a review, I remember, used that phrase, the river novel in Bangla, of which she thought the Hungry Tide was, an analog in English. But, there's no shortage of the uncanny in Bankim or in Titash or in, let's say, Tarashankar, who also writes river novels or has written river novels. But they seem to you to fail to engage with the real uncanniness of nature, the extent to which nature is beyond our ken. And certainly they fail to engage for you with the extent to which human beings have interfered with or affected the rhythms of nature in this, what we call the Anthropocene.
Um, I would never fault. I would never fault Bunkim or Advaita Mallobarman or anyone for failing to engage with the uncanny. Because I think actually what we do see in the Bengali and the Indian novel, even in the early to mid 20th century, is a resistance against the prosaic nature of the novel. People are trying to engage with uncanniness in various ways. And, one of the reasons why I particularly wanted to discuss Rajmohan's Wife and Advaita Mallobarman and so on in this book is because one of the really startling things you notice when you start reading about climate change, when you start dealing with the whole literature on climate change, is that it is the most singularly Eurocentric discourse that exists today. It's completely Eurocentric. I mean, there's absolutely no reckoning with, the non-white world. Basically, I mean, sometimes this is done in a kind of self-flagellating way. Oh, we created the problem, so it's us. that kind of thing. But you'll see there's an absolutely systematic sort of elimination of the other dimensions of the issue. Whereas it's actually a stark fact that it's the acceleration of Asia in the 1990s that has precipitated the climate change crisis. You know, maybe the crisis would have happened at some point anyway, but it's certainly, India and China which have precipitated this crisis. So we are very much at the heart of climate change. And yet, for us as individuals, for us as a culture, I think climate change doesn't really figure on our horizon at all. And conversely, in the West, people who do write about climate change, there's a complete absence of any reckoning with the with a non-Western experience. That again is why I think Pope Francis's document is really I think the most important and the most humane document that I've seen on climate change, because he singularly, because of the nature of the Catholic Church, is so intensely aware of what climate change means for the poor, and also how global this experience is.
For Asia and Africa, yes. And I thought the end to that last essay where you talk about the Laudato Dei is just extraordinary. But you do conclude in your set of essays that Western imperialism, while obviously accelerating the pace of global warming as a consequence of its own reliance upon fossil fuels, such as coal and oil, has also retarded it by keeping large parts of the earth in comparative subjection and poverty, and removing from colonized peoples the power to compete with the West. And so this is a paradox of climate change, which you just referred to. It's the acceleration, the economic acceleration in Asia that has really precipitated climate change upon very large populations. And I'd like to just add a little footnote to your use of the word derangement in your title. The Great Derangement, it's an extraordinary title, very